Is this all working? Okay, excellent. So yeah, thank you everybody. In fact, I have the chemical engineering department here to thank for putting me on a less than traditional path. I think I was one of the classes that got 2 rounds of the ARIS lectures, just the way that we timed out. And I remember very early in one of my seminars, there was one about public policy. And that gave me enough gumption, perhaps, to walk across the Mississippi River and go talk to the public policy department over there. And I ended up, along with my degree here, getting a minor in public policy, which took me on an interesting and unique path. So before I get any further, I am required. So I work for the federal government, and I've worked for several parts of it, so hold on. We've got this and this one. So just so you know, the opinions are mine and mine alone and do not represent me, the federal government, or any other version of that I have done. Thank you. All right, now on to things. So I work for kind of a unique part of USAID, and USAID is the US Agency for International Development. And you might have seen them in the news, you might kind of have, some familiarity. They drop 50-pound bags of rice after tsunamis. We do vaccination programs, we do food aid, but we actually do a lot more complex things. It's not just crisis management, it is working in development and in new and different ways. And to do that, I work in one particular division called the Global Development Lab. And the government uses the word lab in a very different way than any of us in this room would. And I work in the Center for Development Research. And what we're really focused on trying to do is bring science and technology to the developing world. And my unit in particular works through universities. So we have partnerships with universities in the United States, all over the world, really trying to bring the power that university has into the developing world and working on those kinds of challenges. So we do that in a couple different ways. One is, because you haven't got enough acronyms yet in my talk, and you will, because again, I work for the federal government. So STEM and STEAM, the government has a version called STIP, Science, Technology, Innovation, and Partnership. And this is kind of the way that we overall look at building the way that we're trying to engage in a new way with new partners, because you can't spend your way out of development, right? We've tried that. You can't. The problems continue to get bigger and more complex, and you have to bring in new partners, because it takes new partners to do this kind of work and to change the paradigm. So one of these ways that we do this is really looking at the power that universities bring. And since I come from this lovely university background, really understanding where universities are and what their powers are. So when we look at universities in developing countries, they are typically seen as training institutions. So they're places that produce the next generation of teachers and nurses and doctors, and that is a fantastic and wonderful goal in development. But it's not enough to move a country into real sustained progress. So you can train individuals, but what you really have to do is to transform universities to not just being the training of students, but being thought leaders and assets for that country itself. And so we kind of talk about what are the ways that a university, what is the power of a university? What have US universities really given to the United States? And can we model that in developing countries and see how we can do that? And so if we talk about that, we'll talk about these things in detail, but kind of, how do you train future leaders? So not just in technical areas, but how do you train people to think critically, to understand data, to predict what might be coming in the future and use that as an asset? How do you support the innovation ecosystem? Because everything is constantly evolving, and a lot of developing countries don't have a private sector or tech transfer offices or things like that to help do that transition. You also, universities in the United States are very big on community engagement. May it be outreach and how do you get people in the door, but it's also things like the farming programs that we have that help support local farmers here and that we solve problems that are happening in our own communities. And that's a big strength that US universities have. We also, US universities really do kind of become those thought leaders. There are times that government, private sector, other entities come to universities and say, this is the problem we're facing. Help us. What do we do? What's going to come next? And that's a very important part of the US system. And then finally, they can be used to kind of, work with very complex problems. So, by the way, my entire presentation is just pictures, so hope you enjoy. But when we talk about kind of these things in individual components, so one of those is how we train students to not just meet the immediate needs of a country, but to meet the future needs of a country. And so when we're talking about that, it's not just what you teach or how you teach, as Professor Kessler described, but it's also who do you teach in a country, right? Are you using these things in an equitable and diverse way? Are you giving opportunities to people, regardless of who they are, so that a country can grow in a new and more kind of responsible and inclusive manner? So, these were some very lovely women in southern Morocco, Western Sahara region. The second thing that you can really look at in universities, and what we're helping to do with our programs, is how do you support universities to move towards innovation ecosystems? And the government loves the word innovation. It's one of those catch-all words. It can mean anything from the medical devices that we've been talking about, devices, gadgets, things like that, all the way through new methodologies, new ways. It's one of those big words that is helpfully not defined so that we can incorporate lots of things into them. But when you're looking at this, what does it mean? And so when you're talking about a developing country, you can't just export solutions from the United States. They don't meet some of the fundamental requirements, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But how do you meet those kinds of things so that you can meet the local need, whatever it is? So actually, I'll be proud to know I do not have a glaucoma. I am being screened for glaucoma. But what's interesting here is that the size of the device, right? The size of this device is small enough to fit on the back of a motorbike. And that is a fundamental and very important thing in a developing country. Because in a developing country, the last mile is the hardest mile, right? And the last mile, if you're like me, you spend a lot of time on motorbikes, once a donkey, that was fun, camels, because a lot of times Jeeps can't make it. There are no roads, right? So how do you screen people where they are for the kinds of things they have? The next is, these pictures are of a TB tracking system. So similar to the device where you swallow the pill because they're so concerned about retention of the entire regime for hepatitis C. TB, when you have drug resistance, multiple drug resistance, or extreme drug resistance tuberculosis, is a very, very scary thing. And so you need to make sure that be able to confirm that people are who they are and are taking their drugs on time. And so this actually uses a biometric thumbprint to achieve that. The solutions don't always have to be high-tech that we're investing in all around the world to solve problems. They can also be low-tech solutions that meet an emerging need in that place. So first one's a solar food dryer. This is very important. It's a product, it's a value add, and being able to preserve food products so that they can last and be either exported or feed people over the course of the seasons. There's also a corn thresher and a water purification system. The important thing about all of these three things, that while they're low tech, they're made with locally available resources by local people and local artisans. And so you're able to get the welders, things, so that you don't have a device that you've put into a country that can't be fixed or that nobody can maintain. And so balancing those kind of needs are very important. Ooh. So the third way that the US has really worked to drive universities, and what we're working on with universities overseas, is to make sure they don't become the ivory towers that is possible. And make sure that that all of the work, the participation, and their kind of commitment is really grounded in the community. These communities are super excited to work with universities, to work with different players, whether they're locally based or based somewhere else, on these kind of challenges, but they want to be seen as an equal partner. And that is one of the things that the US got very strongly, did very strongly when they really did the local farmer engagement model with land-grant universities. And this is another model that we see in developing countries and we work to support. The next one is influencing and producing thought leaders. So it's not just important to solve for problems for today, but how do you solve today, how do you talk to different communities today versus or how do you talk to different kinds of leaders who can influence both today and tomorrow? And so when you're talking about that, how do we set up universities so that they can respond to political questions? Whether they're policymakers or elected officials or regulators. When you're setting up those kind of new things in a community, how do you work to make that response happen? And finally, universities are used to, especially in the United States, solving complex problems. And so being able to support that kind of work, the work that engineers are particularly good at, of solving complex problems, whether it's flooding, I think this is Liberia, that's, by the way, cholera-laced water. Whether it's those kind of problems that are health and infrastructure, agriculture, food, they span many sectors, they influence and affect many people. How do you really work to bring those things together? So when we look at things, I find that the departments that I love working with the most are the engineering departments, because they're not afraid of those 5 things that I mentioned before. They want to take on complex problems, and they see that as their mission. They want to have relevant solutions that are timely and that meet needs and that use the limited resources that may be available. It's when you set up, kind of the basic engineering problem, which most of us have done. You start with, what are my assumptions? What are my constraints? That is the fundamental nature of engineering in the developing world, is that if you fully understand my motivations, my constraints, and work with them instead of against them, you can create new solutions that really can impact many, many people. So I'll give you that is possible to kind of engineer solutions with limited resources and in crisis settings. So for example, this is me. This is an Ebola suit. This is the 16 layers of protective clothing that you need to put on and take off every 2 hours if you're working in an Ebola hospital. It takes about half an hour to put on and about 25 minutes to take off. And yeah, people have timed it. It takes 2 people to put on and 4 people to take off, each and every time you do this. And so one of the works that we did is that's not acceptable. Also, by the way, all the protective equipment is designed for American men, perhaps of your size. And I find that most doctors and nurses in developing countries are my size or smaller. And so none of it fits. It's amazingly hot. There's 12,000 layers and none of it fits. Because working in an Ebola hospital is not hard enough, go ahead and do it while standing in all of this. So the question is, as a development agency, what could we do to improve this problem? And could we do it quickly enough to meet the needs of an emergent crisis? And so we convened what we call grand challenges. And the grand challenge here was about Ebola, and there were several different kind of pathways in it. But one of them was about creating a new protective equipment. And we highly encouraged interdisciplinary teams made from people all over the world. And ended up, the winners of this one were unique because it was a team that included a wedding dress designer. Because come to find out, they know a lot about taking on and off bulky equipment. Especially ones that have to be kept pristinely clean. And so it was, just kind of that way of bringing in new partners that we talked about. So when we think about kind of the engineering challenges, what does it take? How do you prepare people to understand what the engineering challenges would be to work in this kind of space? Because it's fundamentally different than working in the United States and setting up the next, plant. And one of them is that you're going to have to overcome some very serious issues. A lot of them are going to be about transportation. This is my favorite way, by the way. It's crocodile-infused water. And I'm the only person wearing a life jacket in this boat. I'm also the only person who can swim, which just means I'll be the last one eaten by the crocodiles. So that's fun. It could also be this kind of thing, where this is a good road, and it's not raining. And so what happens, and how do you get both your product and your inputs in and out of a place that the roads are unreliable, or as soon as it rains, everything's going to shut down? This could be your most favorite means of transit. That's George, by the way, I named him. We spent about 3 weeks together. I was very fond of George. He actually got me where I needed to go. But if this is what you're working with, how do you design around and to meet that? And then finally, sometimes you can plan on what the problems are going to be, and sometimes you can't plan on what the problems are going to be. Liberia Airport welcomes you. There's 4.5 feet of water on top of the tarmac. Things like that. You could also be working on the edge of the Sahara Desert, or in Pakistan where it's 111 degrees outside, and that's a good day. So how do you design products and solutions and methods that will work in both, harsh conditions, unknown conditions, and things that change constantly? The next thing you have to do is you really have to be able to engineer to meet the needs that are both happening right now and to try to prevent future problems. So this is what the average garbage dump looks like. There are humans so there's no separate stream recycling in most developing countries, of course. There are humans that will sort through garbage to reclaim recyclables because they have a value and you can sell them. So if you know that that is the situation in a place, then your solar battery system should probably, that they'll be disposed of like this. How do you design them in a way where you're not going to cause undue harm to how the system may or may not work in the future? And so that is one of those other considerations to take in place. There are some great parts of this. You get to work in very unique environments. And I've been told that you can never have too many pictures of animals in presentations. So we'll hold on to that. You also work with a very diverse set of people. And so this is one of the really important things. And being able to take in those kind of considerations is really important. And finally, absolutely in amazing locations. Because this work has to happen everywhere. And the US is turning more and more towards working in engineering and developing countries as they grow and develop in their own ways. So with that, I'll leave you with, which I thought was funny because both the person and the quote, that these opportunities are really the crux of engineering, and that solving an insoluble problem is the ultimate goal. And because, again, not enough baby animals, that's me. So I'd love to take any questions, and